Welcome back to another episode of Novelio. Today is Saturday, May 29th, 2021. I'm going to continue on with my reading of Hot Winter Sun. Attempting to avoid Lizette at the Ashingtons' home that fateful spring of 1646, Catherine wandered alone to the courtyard to view its interesting sculptures. The men were closeted in the study discussing escape plans. Catherine was restless and on edge at Briarwood, and Julian insisted she come with him to help get her mind off the negative situation into which they were all thrust. Despite her efforts to avoid her, though, Catherine eventually heard Lizette's rather shrill voice. "It's warm, Matilda, but it's blustery. I don't want to appear windblown when we go back inside." "Heaven forbid Lizette appear windblown as we refugee to France," thought Catherine, laughing to herself at the woman's shallowness. "It seems to me there is indeed something between those two," Lizette said. "Do you think Julian will actually marry her?" With a start, Catherine realized that the conversation underway was about her. "I believe he is in love with her, yes," Matilda answered. "Well, certainly with her appearance, at any rate," Lizette said dryly. "Such things wear off, though. Have Stephen's attentions strayed already?" Lizette chuckled. "Why must you always be so crass?" Matilda answered. "All I was saying was that many men fancy themselves in love with Catherine when they have never had a private word with her. However, Julian lives in the same household. He would certainly know her far better than other men in the neighborhood, and he doesn't seem the type to marry someone based on beauty alone." She did not add, "Why do you suppose he didn't marry you?" "I still say it's only a physical attraction. Of course, it's his duty to marry her either way." At this, Catherine froze, unaware that she was holding her breath. "Duty? His duty to marry me? I did hear she may be an invalid one day. Some heart malady," Matilda said. "I suppose it is his moral duty to wed her because of what happened to his brother, and the fact that her child, his nephew, is Briarwood's heir. Although under the present circumstances, I'm not sure how important that is any more. There may be nothing to inherit if the Roundheads have their way." "Yes," sighed Lizette, "he was always one to fulfill his obligations, although inwardly she knew it was far more than that. I hope life won't be too intolerable in France. I can't imagine most French aristocrats giving up their finest homes for English refugees. We'll probably all be living in rambling farmhouses until we can come home." Like everyone else, Matilda regarded Lizette as rather depthless and thought she had little or no grasp on the seriousness of the situation. Catherine, however, was no longer listening. She slowly walked over to the topiary gardens, feeling heavy-hearted. Duty? The words suddenly sounded ugly. How horrible! To have someone marry you because he felt obligated to do so for one reason or another. Part of her was aghast, yet the rest of her refused to believe that he had anything to do with it. He clearly loved her. It was in every look and touch and gesture. One day she was passing by Carinsa's still room and thought she would get her opinion on the matter without giving away why she was asking. "Carrie, do you think Julian is always concerned with duty? Do you think that would come before anything else?" "Such an odd question. He certainly always has done so, in my opinion. He makes sure everyone makes a proper living here and that no one is cheated. He and Robert always took care of shut-ins. He runs the estate expertly and never allows anything to slide. He was even cordial to Lizette until it became impossible to do so. And of course he brought your brother and sister here. I guess that would be considered duty, although it's clear that he absolutely adores those children." Carinsa smiled. "Yes," Catherine replied in a way that Carinsa would have described as absent-mindedly. "Is there a reason you're asking this? Is there something you wanted him to do?" "I was just wondering if he would feel obligated to fight for Pendennis Castle," Catherine said, as it seemed a good reason as any to give about why she was asking the question, although in truth they had already discussed the subject. Many men in Cornwall who would have otherwise involved themselves in one last stand now feared that there was nothing to be gained by risking their lives for a king who was going to be dethroned regardless. When discussing it with Richard a few months ago, Julian had said, "I'm not so sure making Catherine a widow twice is the best course of action laid before me at this point." Richard, of course, knew of his intentions to marry Catherine. "Robert's child deserves more than that, as do Clarissa and Matthew, and your own wife. I think if we go into exile with our king to help him build an army abroad, we would be serving him better. Perhaps when people grow tired of Puritan rule, they will invite Charles back. Richard had wondered aloud if His Majesty would even make it to France, or if he would stubbornly remain in England awaiting God's divine intervention. Few subjects could understand how their king failed to realize that his refusal to compromise had ultimately lost him his kingdom, even if at that moment he still wore a crown. They also discussed how they might preserve their estates for that time in the future when they might return. It was a topic on virtually every man's lips. Some had wildly extravagant plans in place, while others had no idea what to do. It would require either being able to convince the parliamentarians that we are for Cromwell, or put someone in place who could play that part, and at least prevent our estates from being destroyed until we can make some triumphant return with the king. It all appears very dismal to me. Richard and his brother-in-law had agreed that the future looked bleak for Englishmen. The next day, Catherine decided to take a long, solitary walk. She tried to banish Lizette's words from her mind, and kept telling herself that nothing coming from her should be taken seriously. She'd become a destructive person, as Julian and Sarah had said on more than one occasion, and Catherine still seethed at her loathsome accusations regarding Christopher. She made her way up the cliff path, taking care to stay away from the areas where the earth could suddenly crumble, but noticed that the route had been changed with a barricade. At one point she walked over to view the scenery and leaned over so slightly on the fence, realizing too late that it was faulty. Because she had no time to catch her balance, she fell forward to a place where there was almost no foothold and only a tiny area to grab on with her hands. Somehow she managed to regain her balance and stepped far back from the path. She took in slow breaths of fresh air to keep herself from fainting. Looking down, she realized that she had cut the inside of her hand and was bleeding at a rapid pace. She wrapped her handkerchief around it and held it up slightly. When she had rested for a moment, she slowly made her way back to the manor where she sought out Julian. "Julian, something happened. Kathy, let me see your hand. What in God's name?" "I fell." "Fell? Why? Was it a weak spell? Why were you out and about if you didn't feel strong today?" Julian demanded. "I felt perfectly fine," she said. "Don't get into a tempest right away. How was I to know everything was different on the cliff path? I don't typically go exploring the grounds every day. I had no way of knowing the path had been changed, and apparently not for the better," she added. "Changed? How?" Julian asked hesitantly. "The part facing north was swung shut, and the only way to proceed was closer to the cliff, but I didn't know that the rail was not safe there, and I nearly went over." Julian was astonished and infuriated because he knew, of course, that someone had done it deliberately, and why. "It was done on purpose," he said, with cold resignation in his voice. "How can you be sure? We can't afford to become paranoid and think every mishap or simple accident is deliberate." Catherine had come to him for reassurance, but somehow knew he was not being fanciful. She listened as he explained. "Long before my grandfather's time, someone had hewn a narrow path along the cliff top. It sounds to me that this is the section to which you were rerouted. It ran approximately 200 yards to where the cliff sloughed off to the ravine below. It's been closed off for many years now, and we have strictly forbidden anyone to use it because it could not be properly repaired. At least not to mine and Robert's satisfaction, and everyone is under express orders to avoid it. We never thought to mention it to you since the barricade was in place by the time you got here, and you would certainly not have scrambled around it like some child. There are numerous weak spots along the area where you almost fell. Catherine, this was an overt attempt on your life. I can't stand here and try to make you think it was just a coincidence when I know it was not." She looked deep into his eyes and finally said the words out loud. "Someone is trying to kill me, Julian, and I believe it was the same man who killed Robert." "Who knew you were coming this way?" he said after a long silence. "Virtually everyone," she replied blankly, remembering how she mentioned it at tea, where numerous family members and servants were about. So once again, there was no way to determine a guilty party because it could have been anyone. "Is this a madhouse, then, love? I think there is madness in it." Later, Catherine overheard the end of a conversation between Julian and Christopher, which commenced with Julian saying, "I only know one thing, and that is everything in life must stop until this is sorted out." "Does that not prove he loves me?" she thought. But the very fact that she was convincing herself showed that malevolent shadows of fear were casting along in her soul. Treacherous thoughts seemed to move in and out of her mind of their own free will. Perhaps because of her highly emotional state, she had a nightmare that night and awoke crying out. In the dream she saw her father's face, menacing, calling her into the flames for all her sins. There seemed to be blood everywhere, and her father ranting about Robert's death being God's judgment. And then suddenly Julian stood there and said, "Robert is dead because of you." Her scream pierced that night, but thankfully did not wake anyone. She was drenched in sweat, and her heart was beating hard and erratic. She told herself it was only a dream, but sleep evaded her the rest of the night, and the feelings and the fear lingered long into the day. "I must compose myself," she thought later. "I am not a young girl who can be scared by nightmares." That evening Julian noticed she looked pale and wan, and asked her if she were ill. It was hard for her to meet his eyes, as she felt tremendous guilt over doubting him even slightly. She knew in her heart it was not Julian who wanted to harm her, and yet, "Catherine, you are unwell. What is it?" "Nothing ails me, in truth," she replied, but he knew her well enough to know she was lying. "How can I explain my dreams to you? How can I explain these unfounded fears? How can I look at you and say, I'm afraid perhaps you mean me harm?" No, Julian was adamant about that. He didn't hold Robert's death against her, not even when it was believed that her father was the murderer. He had said it time and again. She mentally put her hand out toward him and said, "Don't come near me until I get this poison out of my soul, because I know it isn't true, and I must be able to face you without even a shadow of this horrible suspicion." Julian, frustrated and tense, went to see Christopher as he was packing for his journey. "What ails her, Christopher? I demand an answer. I swear I will bring a court doctor here to attend to her if someone does not tell me soon what it is wrong. And don't say I would not understand. At least give me a chance." "A physician would not have a remedy," Christopher replied calmly to his tirade. "It's fear, Julian, and no doctor can cure it. She takes bits of one conversation and then another and overthinks it all. It creates a different reality from the one that lies in front of her. She told me that she's had nightmares as well, and always the villain turns into someone other than her father." "Am I the violent one?" Julian finished. "I'm sorry, Julian," Christopher said sincerely, "but she cannot help what she dreams, as can none of us." "Of course not," he replied impatiently, "but people realize dreams are just dreams, do they not? Naturally, she knows it's not real, but the feeling stays with her. It's a separation of logic from emotion and difficult to understand. She thinks too much and too long about things, and then these dreams come along to further distort her reality. I don't mean to make her sound mad. She is obviously in possession of her mind, but her heart and her soul were damaged by that man. I refuse to call him my father." Julian nodded. "And then people hell-bent on causing trouble, such as Lizette, get gossip going, and that affects her as well." "But what can I do?" Julian demanded. "If you can't show me the way, then who can?" "Do the same thing I advised you before. Be the man she is in love with and wait for her to come to you." She has not done so, not for the last 2 nights," Julian said, aware of the fact that it was a peculiar conversation to have with her brother, yet knowing all the same he could have it. "I do not understand what happened. It seemed that all was settled down between us. She belonged to me, and I belonged to her, and then it began to go wrong again. When I think of going through the rest of my life without her, I can't even draw breath. She has 100 thoughts all at once. When that happens, she backs away from whoever or whatever it is until she resolves it all in her mind. For one, she still has a fear of being regarded as a woman of bad character, since this is what my father's mission was with her. I believe she also fears deep down that you are just doing your moral duty to marry her because of Robert and his son. She told me that more than once, although I'm not sure what gave her that idea. Then other times she thinks it is only passion you feel for her that will die one day, leaving nothing behind to keep you together. All this is in her mind, and she says nothing to me." "Yes, Julian, and you cannot fix it with a tirade." Christopher smiled. "Be of good cheer. Let her adjust in her own way. Be there when she turns to you again, as I know she will. I must be more like my brother. I know that she never had this guard with Robert. She wouldn't have felt the need. He was the better man, Christopher, you must take my word for that. He was in complete harmony with her. I thought I finally was too, he said in frustration. What she must remember above all else is that she loves you. That will never change. Do not fall back into your old, forceful ways with her, though. You do not need new advice. You simply need to follow the old, and all will be well, he said firmly. You're an extraordinary man for one 10 years my junior, Julian answered. True to her personality, however, Catherine was unable to stop dwelling on conversations she had overheard and formed her own erratic conclusions, only to talk herself out of them later. She continuously overanalyzed every nuance and gesture rather than taking the simple approach her brother recommended. The events of the last year ran ceaselessly through her mind, and she could not stop it or blank out the pictures. For a few days she was free of nightmares, but one morning she jolted awake, suddenly remembering Lizette's voice in a dream, saying rather shrilly, "An extravagant plot of Julian's." Her hand flew to her heart. "Oh no, it can't be," she whispered into the darkness. "I won't believe it because of these heinous dreams or anything that woman says. Julian loves me." After breakfast, she took a solitary ride in an effort to sort her thoughts once and for all. She did not cry. There were no tears inside. They had gone with the memories of the last nightmare, and she was empty now of everything except fear. It was a relief to feel something, perhaps due to her tendency to stoicism, but she did not want to be carried away by this terror. It lay like a cold thing where her heart should be, and she forced herself to think of all Julian had done for her and the love he continuously professed. No, Julian cannot carry on an act. He's not the type who could do it. Whatever emotion is underneath is also on the surface. He is not behind this, nor is he marrying me out of obligation or guilt. He would find another way to fulfill duty than to marry where he did not love. Maybe deep within I am just afraid I will not be able to keep his love for a lifetime. Ultimately, Catherine returned from her ride feeling slightly better than she had over the past few days, but naturally it was not long before Julian reverted to his old way of behavior. He was relentless in his pursuit for marriage, and yet the more intensely he sought her out, the more fearful she became, still worrying that his emotion was merely the blaze of physical passion that would eventually die. "Kathy, this has gone on long enough. You must marry me," he commanded, meeting her coming back from her ride. "No, I need time." "You need time?" he asked incredulously. "After telling me you were in love with me? After sharing a bed with me, you need time now?" His eyes met hers, and he sensed the inner force of this woman for whom he knew he was no match, although it was concealed so often by her restrained manner. "Time, yes, and I shall have it." With this she slipped away and did not look back, and his obvious anger did nothing to improve her state of mind. He felt as if all the ground he had gained with her was now lost, and threw down his riding crop in frustration, uttering several indelicate words, only to turn around and find himself face to face with Carinza. "I'm sorry, Julian," she said quickly. "I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but when I heard the nature of the conversation, it was too late to leave without drawing attention to myself, and I thought Catherine would be very embarrassed." "I understand," he replied, waving away her apology. "I've driven her away, Carrie," he went on. "I'm afraid that every step I take with her will always be the wrong one. Christopher warned you not to pressure her, yet you still could not listen." Julian passed a weary hand over his eyes, and Carinza simply shook her head and walked away. She found Catherine a little while later in one of the smaller drawing rooms. "Hiding from my stepbrother?" she asked without ceremony. "Oh, Carrie," Catherine said, "I'm so conflicted in my emotions. I suppose I shouldn't weigh you down with my problems." Catherine was thinking of Carinza's own romantic troubles and thought it may be better to not speak to her of such topics. "If you are thinking you shouldn't broach the subject of romance due to my entanglement with Harold, you can put those fears to rest. I am not nearly as dejected as everyone seems to think about that any more. He would have been a terrible husband if he was that easily distracted, so you may speak to me by all means." "Julian is just so emotional and impetuous. I could see him easily being carried away by merely your beauty," Carinza finished, and Catherine thought with horror that this was likely the worst thing to say to Carinza, but she seemed completely unfazed. "I do understand, Catherine, and I respect you for it. It could never abide I could never abide beautiful women acting as they didn't know they were attractive. It's pretentious and ridiculous. I used to hate when Lizette would do it. You love him and you want what's best for him, she went on, and at the same time you do not want your heart broken. 'Tis entirely natural, but I do believe he has some say in the matter. After all, Julian is always sure of his own mind. He certainly never bothered to ask for anyone's hand before, nor indeed even thought of it, she said with a droll twist of her lips. I do not believe he will marry you and come to regret it. Do you think you know him well enough to make such a prediction? Catherine asked intently. I guess as much as anyone can know another human being, but I suppose we all have times when we surprise each other. Then Carintha suddenly laughed. I think these things have a way of working themselves out no matter what. Call it fate, divine providence. I think it will come out exactly as it's meant to. Her serenity was moving, as Carintha was usually more inclined to ruminate. Catherine wondered about that, and then Carintha said, just be happy and don't worry. I think things have a better chance of turning out right when people give themselves time. I've learned the hard way that it's rushing into confrontations and explanations that spoil relationships. Catherine pondered Carintha's words and those of her own brothers just that morning. Marry the man, Kathy, Christopher had said. Let your mind rest and follow your heart. You will regret it forever if you don't. Don't spoil both your lives over these vague and groundless fears. Perhaps it was time to listen, but still there was this hesitation in her soul. As Christopher made his way to the stables to depart, Julian walked with him, full well knowing it would be his last information-finding mission before the end. Nevertheless, all he could think of was Catherine. I am bewitched and captivated by her, and I wonder how I will ever do another thing in this life until all is well between us. She brought so many things to my life that I never knew were there, Christopher. There's certainly no other woman on earth who could have given me a hot winter sun. He stopped for a moment and looked at the younger man's quizzical expression and then continued. It was there. There was a room in this house. I saw her there once during the winter, and she said that because of the windows. He suddenly looked at Christopher and cried, Oh, the devil with it, and Christopher laughed boisterously. Never mind, I shall ask what that means later, Christopher said, but then became serious again. You know well at this point that the heart of the issue is just fear. Treat her casually without this intensity for a while. Casually? After all what we have been to each other? Yes, you must try to appear light-hearted and romantic, rather than so dark and desperate. If your brother could, he would tell you I am right. Yes, he was correct with her as he was about everything when he lived. I should have done far less talking and far more listening when he was on this earth. As Christopher departed, he knew Julian would not follow his advice, but prayed that it would somehow come out right. True to what Christopher predicted, the strain between Julian and Catherine escalated to the point where virtually every member of the family was aware of it, yet unable to broach the subject. It was as if they were waiting on edge in combined tension to see the last chapter of the play. I came to the meadows to be alone, Julian. Stop persisting with this conversation. I want to think. He could tell there was anger welling up from that silent place where she kept so much hidden, but he pushed on anyway. No! Overthinking everything is what led us to this pass. Can you honestly say you are more content now than you were a week ago? She slipped past him in irritation, but he could no longer suppress his emotion. Catherine, do not walk away from me when I wish to speak to you. He took her arms and turned back around, completely unaware of the force of his grip. Julian, let go of me. You vex me with this. I shall take Robert and leave. No, you shan't pull that trick again. You think I am willing to lose you twice? There's not the slightest chance of it. You just can't change. You can last only so long until you're ordering people about and arranging their lives. He was somewhat taken aback, but his expression was light. You're never more beautiful than when you're angry. We've not had a good battle since you've been home. It reminds me of the Kathy who slapped me in the hall. It pleases me, this verbal sparring, so long as it doesn't continue too long. Then seize at this, and it won't. I can take this pressure no longer. She began to wrench out of his grasp. Stop! I don't care how much you struggle. I am not letting you go because I must speak to you. Then speak, but I'm not going to marry you if I think I will make you unhappy. Can't you see that it would be too much humiliation to bear? It would crush the life from me. You are fixated on this nonsense when I can't even look at another woman. Now you can't, but what happens when I begin to pale? What happens when I'm here with my child and perhaps not able to bear another? Not strong enough to keep up with your whirlwind life, and you grow tired and frustrated and bored with me and so many Lizettes in the world to claim your attention. I couldn't bear it, Julian. It would destroy me. He released her almost violently and stood back. Well, it seems I have much to learn about the type of husband you think I would be. Tell me more. Will I beat you and lock you up with no food or water? Stop it, Julian. That's unfair. You know I don't believe you would mistreat me. You've done everything for me. I could never repay you, but it would be more than I could bear to. For me to decide I am bored and cast you aside to seek another? What's the difference? It's just as cruel. I guess it is no small wonder you would not want a man such as that for your husband. What makes you so sure I am unable to pledge marriage and fulfill those vows? Because silly women in the neighborhood constantly had your ear and prattled nonsense about my past escapades? Well, what of it? Did you think I lived to this age as a monk? I certainly did not think that, but with so much to compete with. Compete! There is no necessity, because there was no woman I ever wanted for a wife save you, and yet you lied and said you loved me. How dare you accuse me of lying about my feelings for you? What about your feelings for me up until a short while ago? Believing I was playing your brother false for money and acting immorally with another man right under his nose. Sometimes I think I shall never forgive you for that. I never truly believed those things. Not really. Maybe way back at the first, before I knew you. I would never think of that now, and I really did not think it then. You say that now, but up until a year ago we hated each other. I know it was partly my fault. I didn't want to see any good in you. I was afraid. I turned away. I was afraid of myself. Her plain honesty touched him, but he was still enraged. Well, according to you, there is no good in me. If we went by the picture you've just painted, and yet you claim to love me. He brushed past her and began to walk away. Julian! She cried and caught his arm, but he pulled away, and his rejection was a strange sensation for her. Julian! She ran to catch him and flung herself into his arms. Forgive me! I can't stand anything but your anger. Try to understand. Don't walk away as if you hate me. I can't bear it. He wanted with all his might to push her away, to make her feel the rejection he was feeling, but he didn't have the strength and instead wrapped his arms tightly around her. Forgive me, she cried again. At this, he grabbed her and kissed her fiercely, passionately, and she wanted it to go on, but finally broke away. Her face was full of turmoil and raw emotion, and he thought she'd never looked more beautiful. It was more than he could bear. You would have stopped yourself from losing Robert if you could, yet you're willing to discard me as if I never existed? No, I don't forgive you. You're ruining both our lives, and I'll never forgive you. She looked stricken, as if her soul was crushed. For the first time she saw utter coldness in his eyes, and it was a shattering feeling. And in one moment she turned, mounted her horse, and fled. He stood there, stunned. He was shocked at himself. How could he have? Kathy! He called after her, but his words were lost in the wind. I'm sorry. Kathy, come back to me. Please. A little further away, another pair of eyes watched the scene. But of this Julian and Catherine were entirely unaware.